My name is Anthony Giordano. Today, for this game journal, I decided to play The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is one of my favorite games because it allows the player to go beyond what is normally expected out of an open world game. You see, when crafting this game, the developers wanted to break free from some of the conventions that have been holding back the Legend of Zelda series for the past couple of years. The game prior to this was The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, which, while a great game, sure, was held back by its linearity and not really allowing the player to do much outside of the specified story beats. Breath of the Wild looked to change all of that. The game starts you off in this simple room where you're given the Sheikah Slate, which will be your tool for the rest of the adventure in order to help you navigate menus and use the game's runes, which are your tools for traversal and puzzle solving throughout the game. I think the introduction of the Sheikah Slate was a great way to provide the player with a streamlined system for going through menus. On the Sheikah Slate, you have access to your map in the game, your objectives, and all of your inventory at a moment's notice. Now, I know that sounds like a pretty normal feature in every game, but the fact that it's tied to a physical object that the player is using in the game really helps to build that connection between you and the game world. One thing I love about this game is how the developers paid particular attention to the small details throughout the game world. For example, here, when Link kicks a chest, understandably, he bounces around in pain like he hurt his foot. Right before you're able to enter the open world, the game does something small that may seem like a normal thing for most players, but is massive for the Legend of Zelda franchise. The game allowed you to climb a wall. I know, not very impressive, but this is game-changing for The Legend of Zelda. Lots of puzzles in the past were based off of the fact that Link can't climb. So now that he can, it opens up a world of new possibilities and puzzles for the franchise. That intro you just witnessed is probably one of my favorite moments in all of gaming. It gives you a second to take in the world of Breath of the Wild that you will be exploring over the course of the next 50 or so hours. Breath of the Wild sets up a massive landscape for you to explore, even beyond the Great Plateau, which the moment you're able to look at that map and see that the Great Plateau is only about, let's say, 14% of the game's map, is a wild revelation for the player. You have so many possibilities in this game, and looking off of this cliff at the start lets you identify, hey, I want to go here, 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 and here, right off the bat. The giant mountain looming in the distance? Yeah, you can go there. Breath of the Wild's approach to tutorialization works way differently than it does in other games. While in most games it's simple, go from point A to point B to point C, Breath of the Wild uses the Great Plateau as its launching ground to teach players all of the mechanics for the game. Once you leave the Shrine of Resurrection, you're free to go explore wherever you want on the plateau. Of course, you have Zelda guiding you to go check out the mark on the Sheikah Slate, so obviously that's your main objective point. However, at this point, you're not required to follow any of that rules. Of course, to progress further in the game, you're going to want to follow along with some of the story beats. However, you are free from that point on to explore to your heart's content. For this video, the element I want to focus on most is the freedom that the developers chose to give to the player. As you can see, the old man is sitting right there, and yet we can just walk on by and not deal with any of his tutorialization. Sure, we miss out on a couple of little bits of lore, but it's nothing that we're going to miss in the long run. In a normal game, you'd be forced to stop there and talk to him for however long. But in this game, it's different. I think this element of freedom works so well, because even though for some players it might be viewed as overwhelming, Breath of the Wild still does a very good job at guiding the player towards your next objective. You're never truly going to be lost on this adventure. However, you are free to approach things in your own manner. For example, for the game's main objective, you're asked to go around to the games for divine beasts, which are the game's puzzle dungeons, essentially. But you're able to go to these dungeons in any order you want, and they're spread across the entire map of Hyrule. Now, it has to be acknowledged that this is a pretty drastic change from what a typical Legend of Zelda game looks like, and not everybody was completely happy with the shift. The developers made this open world change with the knowledge that the last game they had created was too linear. So this time they decided, okay, let's make the least linear game possible, which came at a detriment to some of the elements, such as the story, which now takes place in a much less linear fashion, which to some fans is not as good as the other games in the series. Now, if that's true is up to opinion, but it is something that's important to recognize when looking at this game. The developers of Breath of the Wild did such a great job of making the world of Hyrule immersive for the player. If I was them, I would have spent a little bit more time making the story more hands-on for the player. In a lot of Breath of the Wild, for the cooler story elements, you're shown what's happening rather than actually getting to experience and play it yourself. A lot of the events of the game happen way in the past, before the player character even shows up. So, while there are many good elements of Breath of the Wild, one area I think that they could have improved on was the story. That's not to say the environment doesn't do a great job of helping to sell you on the story that they came up with. Breath of the Wild is full of small details that allow you to put together the pieces of the story that they wanted to tell. In class, we talked about how the concept of a game is always evolving. I think for the developers, when Breath of the Wild came out, open world is the way that the game industry was going. Now, while it looks like today a lot of the focus is more towards virtual reality, for a while open world was the new big thing. It's the moment when you raise the Sheikah Tower from the ground when I think the scale of this game really starts to set in for the player. After seeing all of the towers rise up from the ground around Hyrule, players are filled with a sense of excitement as they realize, okay, I get to go explore in this desert, in this snowy mountain, in this tropical forest throughout the entire game. Breath of the Wild does a great job of foreshadowing the places players will get to go later in the game, should they choose to. An interesting risk I think this game took when it came to its development was with the music. As you notice through most of this gameplay footage, there's not a lot of music happening. And that's because Breath of the Wild's developers decided to go with an ambient music approach, which means that music would only play during critical moments, such as when you're fighting an enemy. This is in stark contrast to how the series has previously handled its music productions, where every moment of the game will be scored with big band music. This moment, where the player finally gets the map of the Great Plateau, I think is a great way for the player to start experiencing the world of Hyrule in this game. I know that sounds obvious with it being a map and all, but for this game in particular, once you're able to go into the world map, you're able to see all of the little details within the world. If you'll notice too on the map, Unlike a lot of other games which have similar concepts of going to towers and getting updates on your map, Breath of the Wild doesn't have a lot of POIs or points of interest on its map. It wants you to go out and explore and make markers on the map yourself. I believe this was done because the developers really wanted to encourage the player to go out and explore and find all of the small details on the map themselves. To close out this video, I want to talk about Breath of the Wild's approach to puzzle design. Unlike the traditional Legend of Zelda games of the past, Breath of the Wild primarily focuses on delivering puzzles through shrines. These are mini bite-sized dungeons, I guess you could put it, where the player will spend anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes solving a small series of puzzles to receive a spirit orb in order to either improve their health or stamina later in the game. This approach to puzzle design really allowed the developers to think outside of the box when coming up with new puzzles. As I said before, Breath of the Wild relies on its runes for its puzzles, these being magnesis, an ability that allows you to pick up and move around any magnetic object in the world, stasis, which allows you to freeze time on an object and use its stored kinetic energy to launch it, cryonis, which allows you to build a pillar out of water, and the bomb rune, which obviously pulls out a bomb and you can throw a bomb. To connect this to something we had been learning earlier in the class, I think it's really interesting to look at Breath of the Wild from a genre perspective, because it doesn't really fit into just one specific genre, such as just action or just adventure. I think Breath of the Wild is one of those great examples of a pure action-adventure game. A game that focuses on a lot of combat elements as well as the puzzle solving, generally focused with an adventure game. I know we had talked about in our discussions about whether things like genres are even important in the game industry anymore. And I think because of games like Breath of the Wild, they absolutely are. Having that title on the box of action-adventure game can really help to sell a new potential customer to play this game. Having that enticement of, hey, this is going to be an open world adventure game, in addition to, hey, it has deep combat mechanics, really can help to draw in a diverse player base. However, I do think it has its limits, because when you think about it, Breath of the Wild is also a very puzzle-heavy game, but it doesn't position itself in the same puzzle genre like a Tetris game does. I think the potential for defining what it means to be in a specific genre has a lot to grow. Naturally, it tends to be a subjective meaning, so it's hard for certain elements of the games industry, such as the ESRB, to nail down exactly what does this genre mean to the most amount of people. So when we're marketing the game, they'll understand it means specifically this type of game. For me, Breath of the Wild is going to remain one of those games that I go back to play over and over again, always finding new details each time I go back. It's one of my favorite games for a reason, so if you haven't given it a try yet, I encourage you to get a Nintendo Switch and go for it. What do you got to lose? Thanks for watching this video.